Hello and welcome to Talking Tudors, a fortnightly podcast about the ever-fascinating Tudor dynasty. My name is Natalie Grueninger and I'll be your host and guide on this journey through 16th century England. Are you ready to step through the veil of time into the dazzling and dangerous world of the Tudor court? Without further ado, it's time to talk Tudors. Hello everyone, welcome back to Talking Tudors episode 150. I'm your host, Natalie Grueninger, and I'm so happy that you could join me. Today's episode of Talking Tudors is sponsored by Royalty Now. Have you ever wondered what people from the past really looked like? What about what they would look like today as modern day people? Royalty Now creates lifelike versions of past portraits and statues, including your favourite Tudors, by combining historical sources and artistic expression. Check out the YouTube channel Royalty Now Studios, where they dive into the history of each figure and then reveal the recreations. Recent popular videos explore what Anne Boleyn really looked like, including a recreation from the famous Holbein sketch, as well as comparisons to the Most Happy Portrait medal. There is also an episode on Catherine of Aragon, with lifelike versions of Catherine created from several portraits throughout her life. You can also find Becca on Instagram at royalty_now_, where she posts a new figure every 2 weeks. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank and acknowledge the wonderful listeners who continue to support this podcast via Podbean Patron, and extend a heartfelt thank you to everyone who's taken the time to rate and review the show. This really does make a difference. If you love the podcast and never miss an episode, perhaps you'd consider becoming a Talking Tudors patron. Just click on the Be My Patron on Podbean badge on the homepage of my website, www.onthetudortrail.com, or click on the Be a Patron button on the Podbean app. Join the Talking Tudors patron family, and in addition to receiving lots of Tudor-themed goodies, you'll be automatically entered into our patron-only monthly giveaways. March's prize is a copy of The Carnival of Ash by John Beckerleg. Thank you to Rebellion Publishing for sponsoring this wonderful prize. All patrons are also eligible to attend monthly Talking Tudors live talks, which take place on Zoom. These events are exclusive to patrons. At the end of the month, I'll be chatting to Dr. Owen Emerson about a new exhibition opening at Hever Castle entitled Becoming Anne, Connections Culture Court. Please get in touch with me if you'd like to register for this event. You can also support the podcast and share your love of Tudor history with the world by buying Talking Tudors merchandise. There are a number of designs and products available, including phone cases, mugs, notebooks, and apparel. Check out all the products at talkingtudors.threadless.com. I would love to see pics of you wearing or using your Talking Tudors merch, so please do tag me on social media and use the hashtag #ILoveTalkingTudors. Now, on to today's episode. I'm thrilled that joining me on the show to talk about the Tower of London is Alfred Hawkins. Alfred has, since 2018, been an assistant curator of historic buildings for Historic Royal Palaces, the charity that manages the Tower of London, Hampton Court Palace, Kensington Palace, Kew Palace, the Banqueting House, and Hillsborough Castle and Gardens. In this role, based at the Tower of London and Banqueting House, Alfred helps to preserve, protect, and share the stories of the buildings and archaeological deposits across the Royal Palace. Our conversation is coming up straight after this short musical break, courtesy of guitarist Jon Sayles. How are you?
I'm fantastic, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing pretty well, thank you. How about we begin with you just introducing yourself to our listeners and just telling us a little bit about your background?
Yep. So I'm Alfred Hawkins, and I'm assistant curator for historic buildings at the Tower of London and Banqueting House, Whitehall. By training, I'm a building archaeologist, and my background is mainly just working in commercial archaeology.
Awesome. And we're going to chat about the Tower of London today, which is very exciting. So I thought we could start with you just telling us just a bit about the history of the tower.
Yeah. So well, I mean, there's 1,000 years of history, so it's difficult to summarize in a few sentences. But yeah, the Tower of London is William the Conqueror's fortress in London, built in two phases from 1078 to 1100, and is then the home of various national institutions and kind of board of ordnance and the crown jewels, obviously, for a long period of time, and is expanded by successive monarchs, mostly by Henry III and Edward I. And yeah, it's one of the oldest continually occupied fortresses in the world.
It is, and I'm sure many of our listeners have heard of it at least, or perhaps even visited. And I know that throughout its history, its very long history, it's had many different functions. Can you tell us about some of these?
Yeah, so I mean, the tower's basically, as a royal palace, it was fairly out of fashion by the time it was completed. It was very rarely ever used as a kind of royal palace. But it is, because it was so secure, it's been a very convenient storage place for the crown jewels, a fantastic location to have a garrison if you're trying to control the City of London. And it also housed the menagerie, which is basically a zoo holding animals that would have been gifted to various monarchs, which formed the basis for the London Zoological Society. The Royal Mint, importantly, and the Board of Ordnance, and the kind of foundation of the National Archives through various record stores in different towers.
Yeah, quite a variety. And obviously it stood sentinel over the City of London for so long. So what are some of the major events that have occurred there?
It really depends on what you would class as major, because obviously some people would say the executions of various notable people that we're going to get into later are incredibly important, but also in terms of the kind of institutional development of England, even the movement of the Mint from Sherwin's Lane near what is now St Paul's Cathedral into the Tower is a very significant part of the monetary history of England. And the crown jewels being destroyed at the end of the English Civil War. And then even later in its history, you've got different things such as World War I regiments, mostly Coldstream Guards being trained within the moat after it was drained, before they went off to the Western Front, and even Rudolf Hess being imprisoned there in 1942. So there's almost something during every period that is, I would argue, nationally important. It depends on how interested you are in those particular events as to what you would classify as a major event.
Yeah, and obviously it's seen many challenging times throughout history. Have the defences, though, ever been breached?
The Tower of London has been attacked a few times. I think possibly in 1191, 1214, 1267, 1381, 1460, and partially in 1471. But in terms of the defences being breached, the kind of big one that we think of is the Peasants' Revolt in 1381, which is slightly an awkward one because they weren't so much breached as they were just let in.
Yeah.
And obviously that wasn't a siege in the traditional sense that you would think of with siege engines and caps of armies. It was a mob of peasants who were let in, stole a load of stuff, and then executed a bishop on Tower Hill. I can't remember exactly which bishop it was, but no, it's changed hands a few times, mostly through, I mean, as most sieges end in surrender. It's very rare that you actually have kind of dramatic battles where the defences are breached, at least in England, because our history is characterised by long periods of relative peace, punctuated with incredibly bloody periods. But because of the tower's location, it's never had any kind of major breach that we would recognise.
Now, of course, this podcast is Talking Tudors, so we do focus on the Tudor period. So let's kind of look at this period for a moment. Can you tell us a little bit about what the Tower complex was actually like during the 16th century? I know there's been obviously some changes after that.
Yes. So after the Tudor period is probably the Tower of London at its kind of zenith as an institutional home. So it's still acting as a royal palace. And if any kind of listeners want to have this image of the tower, the best thing to Google would be the Hayward and Gascoigne plan of 1597, which is kind of the oldest cartographic source we have of the Tower of London, and is incredibly detailed. And we know there are a few things which don't quite match up with the archaeological record that shows what the tower is used for. So going from the centre outwards, you obviously have the White Tower, and then to the south you have the Queen's apartments, the Great Hall, and the King's apartments. And then in the what we would now call the inner ward is the Chapel of St Peter ad Vincula, various storehouses for the Board of Ordnance, and kind of mostly residential accommodation. And then in the outer ward is, which was built by Edward I, is the Royal Mint, and again storehouses and all of that kind of stuff. So it's basically fulfilling all of its functions at the same time during the 16th century. It's not quite declined as a royal palace to the point where it's used, because obviously Anne Boleyn and Henry stayed there before Anne's coronation, and it receives massive overhaul in 1532 under James Needham to be kind of ready for that process. But it's also still seen as a convenient storehouse more than anything.
And you mentioned a few buildings there that I'd love to chat to you about. So one of them was, of course, the Queen's apartments, which, as you said, is where Anne stayed prior to her coronation. And then tragically, it's where she stayed during her imprisonment as well. So what do we know about this? Doesn't exist, sadly. I when I visit, I kind of stand there just wishing that I could see it, but it's not there anymore. What do we know of this building?
Yeah, it's very disappointing that kind of whole complex of buildings are lost, because as I've said, the White Tower isn't really used as a royal palace, but the what we now call the St. Lawn was. And the loss of the Great Medieval Hall and all of those apartments is deeply disappointing, particularly as almost all of the archaeology in that area has also been destroyed by kind of subsequent buildings, mostly for the main guard, which was a garrison building. But no, so the Queen's apartments were. We've got a few descriptions, been mostly from that 1532 scheme of works and Hayward plan. So it's probably a timber framed building with brick nogging, which is, for anybody who doesn't know random architectural terms, is where brick is kind of inlaid in between the frame so that you can still see timber frame, which is very kind of typical Tudor aesthetic. But yeah, as far as the inside goes, I certainly haven't seen any definitive descriptions of the interiors of the Queen's house, of the Queen's apartments rather. But if you would like to see what the Great Hall looked like, which was obviously where Anne Boleyn was at her trial, the closest survival to that is the Great Hall of Winchester, which is an absolutely fantastic building. But no, so I mean that's largely all we know. I mean, we can speculate what they would look like inside, because it's a Tudor building of incredibly high status, so it's probably got decorative features similar to those that we can see at Hampton Court and Hever Castle before it was violated by Aston. So yeah, it's an interesting one, and that plan kind of is really one of the only things that we have that allow you to kind of visualize the tower as a royal palace, which is incredibly useful. But no, it's a massive shame that they're not there anymore.
I know. Oh gosh, what I'd give to just have a little look at that. And you're right, I've been to the Great Hall you mentioned, and that's amazing to stand there and even just when you speak and the echoing, and you can just picture what must have been happening, in the one at the Tower during their trial, must have been absolutely incredible. So, of course, Anne is one of the most famous prisoners of the Tower. Tell us about some of the other kind of prominent prisoners.
Well, it again depends what you think in prominent. Usually, the core list is St. John Fisher, St. Thomas More, Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, Jane Grey, Dudley, and Elizabeth I. But even right through to the modern period, you have the Cray twins being held in the Waterloo block and have actually stood in the cells, which are now house water tanks, which is interesting. But no, so I mean, John Fisher is obviously Bishop of Rochester, and not particularly supportive of Henry VIII's decision to split from Rome, and is subsequently executed. Thomas More, largely the same story. Everyone knows the story of Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn and Lady Jane Grey are probably the two saddest stories of executions at the Tower, of people who we can actually name and know about their story. Anne Boleyn, obviously, because it is the site of her crowning achievement, literally, and probably the happiest point in her life, and also the saddest point in her life. And Lady Jane Grey, obviously, because she was caught up in things to an extent, and if you believe some of the accounts, witnessed her husband being pulled past her apartment in a cart after being executed. So yeah, there are lots of people, but it's not in terms of kind of the social history of England and the Tower's importance. I think we do sometimes focus too much on those kind of big ticket names, because the Tower is also an incredibly important prison throughout the medieval period for Jewish people, which my colleague Rory has just published on for free a huge database of, I think it's over 200 individual kind of accounts of different Jewish people who are imprisoned at the Tower and why they were imprisoned there. So it's always used as a prison because it's incredibly secure. But sometimes I think it's worth stepping back from the great, the good, the traitorous, and the victims, and seeing how the Tower is used as a kind of a more large scale prison, which has a slightly larger impact on kind of the social fabric of Britain.
Yeah. So in terms of its function as a prison, when did that begin? So was it operating as the palace and the prison kind of side by side at the same time?
Yes, I can't remember his name, but I think the first record we have of somebody being held prisoner is in 1100, and my colleagues are going to never forgive me for forgetting his name, because I should have that off the top of my head. So that's largely when we know the tower was completed, because there are no records saying the tower is not finished. We know it was started in 1078 and lasted that building lasted for about 10 years, and then there was a small break, and then another building phase started. We can see that very clearly in the fabric of the White Tower through different mortar types and construction techniques. But we assume having this prisoner in 1100 means the tower is largely finished, because it is then secure. And then, again, the tower story, as fantastic as it is a story of convenience. It is a colossal structure in London that is incredibly secure. And so if you have some people who you don't really like or don't want them to be roaming around free, you can keep them there. And it's also important to mention that it's not a prison for the great and the good. This isn't a prison in the same way as you think of a normal prison in the medieval period. It's actually quite luxurious. The buildings are made of stone. They are colossal. They are relatively easy to keep. There's lots of documents of different prisoners bringing in servants and books, and Walter Raleigh having a garden where he would make his incredibly poisonous concoctions as kind of health drinks and medicine, various other things. But it has operated as a prison alongside being and all of the other different things that it has, because it is convenient to do so.
Yeah, so fascinating. And in terms of the executions, obviously some people we know were executed within the Tower complex, then lots of other people on Tower Hill. Do we have any kind of numbers for those executions roughly in its history?
Yeah, the numbers are difficult. So the ones, the kind of, again, the big ticket people who are executed inside the Tower, and I think it's probably important to explain a little bit of context here. So the obviously executing people is not it's something that you do in order to project authority and to show this person, to show somebody as an example. Effectively, it is obviously the absolute end of disciplinary means. So executing someone behind closed doors doesn't really achieve what its purpose is. So, as you say, the majority of the executions that occurred at the quote-unquote Tower actually happened on Tower Hill, which is across a lovely road in a memorial, what is now a memorial garden. So that is, I mean, that's important to remember, because obviously you would have the view of the tower in the background as a colossal example of royal power, and you would see these people executed, and it would be the day out, the thing. Oh, we'll go and watch an execution today. It's kind of like a game of football, but a horribly grotesque one. So executions inside the tower are reserved for people who are of such significance that they're given a modicum of respect, which sounds weird in you're having your head cut off, however you're being executed in a respectful way. But it is, because it means that you don't have to deal with kind of the baying crowds and screaming and having things thrown at you and people trying to steal bits of your body for kind of trinkets and dipping handkerchiefs in your blood, as you see in the terror in France. So in terms of the actual people, you've got William Hastings, who is the first Hastings, the Duke of Gloucester, Queen Anne Boleyn, Margaret, Countess of Salisbury, Queen Catherine Howard, Jane Boleyn, Lady Jane Grey, Lord Dudley, and Robert Devereux, I think, off the top of my head, are the kind of big people who are executed inside the tower. And we have got a memorial in what we call the execution site of the tower, which is a glass sculpture, which I will reserve judgment on. Obviously, within a medieval fortress doesn't quite work. But that isn't actually located where the execution site would have been. It's more likely, and show that the execution site was actually towards the north of the White Tower, outside the main entrance for the Waterloo Block, which is where the crown jewels are held. The problem with that is that area is called the parade ground because it is a parade ground. So we often have various regiments visiting and still have lots of different ceremonies of state that occur. So that space is needed for people to march across. And if you plonk a great big memorial in the middle of it, that wouldn't be particularly useful. So after all of those great and good, we also have a number of German prisoners of war who are executed in the 20th century, which is something that quite a few people forget. Is the tower doesn't cease to be a place of execution. At the start of the 17th century, it actually carries on throughout. So in terms of numbers, I wouldn't be surprised if there were more than we know about, because obviously military executions would just occur, and they're not always incredibly well documented, particularly in the distant past. But I would be surprised if it's more than 30 or 40 people. Honest, because if you're going to execute someone, unless they are incredibly significant and you want to give them that modicum of respect, it doesn't make any sense to do so behind closed doors.
And I imagine that our listeners, when they think about the tower, apart from thinking obviously about executions and that kind of thing, immediately also think of the wonderful beef feeders that are there and probably have taken a photo with them as well, and the ravens, of course. So I want to talk about these two aspects of the tower. So maybe let's start with the warders or the beef feeders. When were they introduced to the tower?
Well, that is a subject of some controversy. It depends. The date largely depends on which yeoman warder you ask, because there are lots of records of different bodies of men guarding the tower before the formal 1485 founding of the yeoman warders. So, but yeah, so the general answer is that the yeoman warders were originally part of the yeoman of the guards, which is the monarch's personal bodyguard, and then in 1485 this body is kind of split in order to provide a small garrison to protect the tower while maintaining that personal bodyguard. So these yeoman warders are granted the right to wear their lovely red uniform, which I am told that is incredibly uncomfortable. So that's the date, 1485, that we usually go for, although it will, don't hang me for that, because it will change depending on who you ask. But the yeoman warders are interesting. So originally, obviously, it was a bodyguard team in order to defend the tower, and then they kind of become the jailers of the fortress. And there are lots of different records of prisoners being lodged with yeomen, which sounds incredibly weird, but it makes a lot of sense, because the tower is a very large space, and if you're trying to keep somebody in one place and you have a body of men who are there to protect the tower, that would make complete sense. But it moved from being that kind of bodyguard to being a position that was bought. So you would buy a position, and that kind of carried on as a more of a status symbol than anything else until the Duke of Wellington became constable in 1826. And along with a whole host of incredibly sensible things that he did, including draining the moat, which was more of a cesspit than anything else, he ended the practice of purchasing a kind of yeoman watership, if you can call that, and then started using ex-military personnel. So the yeoman warders today all have to have 22 years military service. They all have to have reached the rank of warrant officer, and they all have to have the long service and good conduct medals. And they're also all, I believe, all sworn in as part of the Yeoman Guard as well. So they are technically part of both bodies. But in terms of day to day, they are members of the security team, and they open up and lock up. But obviously, their most iconic job is to give their tours, which are more or less funny depending on which yeoman you have, because some of them love dad jokes and some of them are. Yeah, no, I mean it's definitely an experience, and I would recommend going on those tours and bothering them for selfies, because they may complain, but they do actually love it.
No, they're a lot of fun. I enjoyed the one I went on. It was, very boisterous man I had that time, but it was fun.
That sounds familiar.
Yeah, that sounds familiar. And what about the ravens? What's the story with the ravens?
Yeah, the ravens are an interesting one as well. So first of all, seeing as lots of people listen to your podcast, actually, I would like to express a plea to all listeners. Please stop stroking the ravens, because they are scavenger birds. And the amount of times I've seen people allow small children to pet a very large bird and is then subsequently bitten or swiped or something like that. And it's just, please stop doing that. But yes, that's a small tangent. But so the ravens, the big myth is the kingdom and the Tower of London I think it's the Tower of London will crumble into dust and the monarchy will fall if the 6 resident ravens ever leave the fortress. And obviously we don't believe in anything as ridiculous and suspicious as that, so we have 2 or 3 spares just in case. But it's the myth is that it was Charles II who was the first kind of monarch to insist that the ravens be kept at the tower. And a funny story is this was given against the explicit wishes of the King's astronomer John Flamsteed, who had made the Flamsteed Tower, which is the only circular turret on the White Tower, the one with the incredibly long staircase that you will enjoy if you visit the White Tower, had made a kind of observation base at the top of that tower, and the ravens notoriously fiddled with his equipment and defecated on various other things. So he fairly swiftly moved over to Greenwich, where the Royal Observatory was built. But it's possible that the ravens played some small part in making it.
I love it. Thank you for that. And you mentioned earlier the moat, and I recently, scrolling through Twitter, saw a video of you talking about some things that were going on in the moat. And I think you've been working with some mudlarkers and sifting through the soil. So what have you found? Any treasures?
Oh, yes. Well, again, a small caveat is the Tower of London is a scheduled monument, and there are various other scheduled monuments in the country. So if you would like to metal detect anywhere, please check what site you're doing it on. And if you don't have explicit permission to do it, just don't, because you can be fined quite a lot or go to prison for breaking the law for doing it. So yes, so the work we've been doing in the moat is part of the construction phase for Super Bloom, which is this kind of large scale transformation of the moat into a kind of a green space, which has been described as fireworks of changing flowers over the years. So we're making various changes, including adding ductwork, kind of mains, electrics, irrigation, all that kind of thing, alongside bringing in, I think we're at 3,000 square meters of soil at the moment, to change the topography of the moat. And then on top of that, a massive path system so that you can actually walk around it, which will be fantastic. But obviously, with that huge project being done for the Queen's Jubilee. We have to keep in mind that the tower is a scheduled monument, it's a World Heritage Site, a lot of the buildings are individually listed, and its archaeological potential is absolutely vast. It is one of the most archaeologically important sites in the City of London. And the moat is kind of one of the more important areas, because when it was a moat for 700 years, it was a very convenient dump. So people both inside the fortress and outside would just throw things in it, which means that it's full of wonderful little items that you don't necessarily find elsewhere. So because of that kind of sensitivity and because of the timescale that we had, I thought it'd be a great idea to get the Thames Mudlark Society in. And I worked with a fantastic guy called Stuart Wyatt, who is the kind of finds liaison officer at Museum of London. So he's got very good connections with the Mudlarks, and whenever they find anything important, he will accession it onto the Portable Antiquities scheme. Or he spoke with the Mudlarks, and they're all very excited. They came in and sifting through our spoil, and I think they came for 3 days, although we might have them in again soon, depending on what we're doing. But in terms of the actual finds they made, it's absolutely remarkable. There's everything that you could possibly think of. And kind of going back to what I was saying about the kind of institutional use of the tower, we found coins that were the Elizabethan period, which were almost and the 17th century, which almost certainly minted at the tower. There are cannonballs, which, if you're slightly more fanciful of them, might have been fired at the tower, although it's likely that they've just come from demolished buildings within the town as part of the process of filling up the moat. A beautiful 15th century French jetton, which is a kind of a counter, although it looks like one, which is incredibly well preserved. A Tudor buckle from a dagger belt. I think it's actually 2 Tudor buckles now. Yeah, I mean, I'm just going off a tangent, but it's
No, all good.
Anything that you can think of that has happened at the tower, we have some small record of that in the moat. So there are animal bones from the menagerie, coins from Tower of London Mint, cannonballs from Ordnance. Yeah, it's absolutely fantastic, and I think it's just under 200 artifacts that we have managed to save now. So it's a very, very valuable experience, and I'm hoping to write a blog about the kind of varied list of things that we've found. So that will be on the HRP website at some point in the future.
Yeah, that sounds really good. And of course, Alfred, I cannot let you go without asking about another aspect of the tower's reputation, and that is, of course, its haunted reputation, reputed to be one of the most haunted places in England and the world. Have you ever had any kind of eerie experiences there?
As a great disappointment to your listeners, the short answer to that is no.
Boo.
I know that I have to remember that I'm an archaeologist at heart, and I know very few archaeologists who believe in ghosts, because a lot of their job is digging up graveyards. So
yes,
the ghosts are an interesting aspect of the tower. Obviously, a lot of people, for better or worse, have interesting connections to various stories of the tower, which are not right or wrong, or and differ according to people. So sometimes, obviously, you can be incredibly emotional when you're at the tower, and then you might see somebody who is actually living in one of the buildings just dart past their window, and you're like, oh my God, that's good. And just because I haven't experienced it doesn't mean that nobody else has. There are some very fantastic stories. Actually, my colleague, Dr. Holden Gregory, wrote a fantastic kind of piece for Inside Story members kind of magazine about, I think it was mostly about the kind of 18th and 19th century kind of romantic ghost stories. And my favorite one of those that he told me about was the ghost of the polar bear, that if you see the polar bear, you die.
Oh gosh.
As this kind of myth of tower ghosts. And there's also obviously Anne Boleyn and various other individuals. The thing I think about in terms of ghosts is, if you were a ghost, why on earth would you loiter around the place where you had your head cut off? It seems very boring. And if I were a ghost, I would like to think that I just stroll around looking at stuff, because I suppose all we have is time. And you can't go on that many Yeoman Warder tours. So no, I've never had any kind of spiritual. Well, that's a lie. I've had emotional moments at the tower, because it is an emotional place and it is fantastic, and the density of history there is absolutely maddening, particularly when it's your job to know about things. No one could know the history of the entire fortress, but other people have, and some of them are more or less fanciful than others. Trying to
Well,
cover all my bases
there's
here.
still time. There's still time. Something could occur. You never know. This could spark
Something
something.
could.
So
I mean,
let me know.
In 2019, we excavated 2 skeletons from outside the chapel, and so they dated between 1450 and 1550. And part of the law of excavating human remains is they need to be secured, stored somewhere secure. And when they were returned from the archaeological unit, our resident chaplain was on, I think he was in Ethiopia actually doing some missionary work. But in any case, we couldn't inter the remains straight away. So they were kept in my office. And I had lots of people kind of coming in and going, aren't you scared of a ghost? And I was like, yep, but if you were a ghost, why would you hang around your kind of mortal remains just slowly rotting away in the ground? Some people get slightly carried away with it. But
I can understand when you're in the tower. I can understand. And the very last thing that we do is what I call 10 to go. So 10 questions just to get to know you a little bit better. So number 1, what was the last book that you read that you can remember?
It is. So this is going to be incredibly boring. I'm writing an article on the legal history of the Chapel of St. Peter at Vincula, because it's very confusing and kind of flits between being Royal Peculiar and not. So the last book I read was the report of the review group on the Royal Peculiars, which was published in 2001.
Okay,
so, sorry, not a particularly popular book.
I can confidently say that no one else has mentioned that book before in all the interviews. And I know, you guys, we're still in our summer, nice hot weather, but you're not. What's your favorite sort of comfort food?
Definitely pizza.
Pizza,
which is probably slightly a basic answer for an assistant curator of a royal fortress. But
no, that's good.
Yeah,
that's good. And do you remember what was one of your favorite childhood toys?
Oh, how embarrassing do I want this to be?
Be honest.
Well, I had a very strange obsession. Have you ever heard of the biker mice from Mars?
No, I haven't.
It's so I was born in 1994, so it was a very, very strange kind of 90s cartoon of these
biker mice
who are the size of humans and ride around on motorbikes, kind of fighting this fish guy who is kind of, I think the kind of general gist is he's stolen all of the resources from Mars and is trying to do the same on Earth, and these biker mice attempt to stop that. And I think it's actually been revamped recently, but I had lots of little plastic motorbikes and mice.
Cute.
I can't believe I've just said that.
We'll all have to Google that now just to see these huge motorbike mice. I love it.
I wasn't expecting that. I should have thought of a lie.
Good, I like that. So what's a new skill that you would like to learn?
Professionally or personally? Am I allowed 2 answers?
Yeah, that's fine.
I would quite like to get better at, so petrology is the identification of different stone types and where they came from. And we do a lot of petrological work at the tower. And it would be nice if I was slightly better at that. It is, unfortunately, an incredibly niche subject. But personally, I would like to be better at drawing. I think I'm a building recorder by training, so I can do very good survey drawings, but I'm not particularly creative. So it would be nice to get better at that.
Fantastic. All right. And what is a favourite holiday destination?
I'm quite boring, I think.
No, you're not. You like those mice, the motorbike mice.
Oh, God, I'm never going to live that down. If I just hide in my room for the next month, and hope that no one at the tower listens to this. No, I quite like the English countryside and walking up Iron Age hill forts. So I also really don't like being very warm. So I can't say, I'd love to go to Greece or Spain or something, because I would literally melt. So yeah, kind of long walks in the countryside, getting very wet when it decides to pour down with rain is probably an ideal getaway.
No, sounds lovely to me. And what about the last film or even film or series that you watched?
I think that's probably got to be the latest season or series rather of The Witcher on Netflix. Not as good as the books, but everyone loves Henry Cavill. So,
yes, yeah. I know. I love Henry Cavill too, but I actually didn't get into that one. I watched like 1 or 2 episodes and I was like, no, sorry, Henry.
No, it's a weird one. I think
it's a bit weird.
Because it's a very popular game. And
then
there are fans of Henry Cavill and then there are fans of the book. I think that they're trying to to please too many different
Yes.
groups who have wildly different expectations, and they're kind of not succeeding in any of them.
Yeah. All right. Favorite genre of music?
Probably just rock, I would imagine. But I kind of grew up with kind of 80s rock. So
What do you do to relax and unwind after a long day at work?
people relax. I don't know.
Not me that much, but I've heard they do.
I try to go to the gym fairly regularly. Just mostly that, and kind of I love visit. Again, I work at a heritage site, and my favorite thing to do is go and visit other random heritage sites. So it sometimes feels like work, but it's quite relaxing, and I'm always up for going and visiting a cathedral. So.
And what is a mystery, historical or otherwise, I guess, that you would love to know the answer to?
There are lots of questions about the tower that I would want to know, just because it would make my life easier. I can't think of any well, actually, yes, I can. It would be where on earth the first chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula was, because it's the building I've done the most work on at the tower, and we know there was probably a chapel there in the 9th century, and then it was demolished, rebuilt until we get to the Tudor building that we have at the tower today. But I would love to know where that chapel was and what form it was, because then it would just complete the story for me. So again, relatively niche.
Okay, great. And lucky last, what is something that you're looking forward to in the next, say, 12 months?
Probably the opening of Super Bloom, because we're currently at a stage where it looks. I mean, we're starting to build features of it, and it will look beautiful, but it does have an essence of the Somme about it at the moment, with mounds of dirt. It would be nice to see that project completed and to get people into the moat, because that's the only place where you can kind of actually experience how big it is and how colossal the walls of the tower actually are. And it's a massive green space in London that we don't use, so having extra flowers there will be great for pollinators and various other things. So yeah, that's the kind of the big things to look forward to next year.
Fantastic. I remember seeing some pictures of the moat during World War II when it was like a victory garden. That was really cool, actually. So yeah.
Yeah, no, it has got a fantastic history, and there was a Silver Jubilee image of it having lots of tulips in there, which was nice. This will dwarf anything. It probably won't be quite as popular as the poppies, but it will certainly, in terms of logistics and the scale of what we're doing, it's the largest change to the moat since 1845 when it was drained. Lots of work, but it will pay off in the end.
Yeah, fantastic. And the very last thing that I ask my guests is for a Tudor takeaway. So this is something for our listeners to go off and explore after the episode. So do you have a Tudor takeaway for us?
Steve, I was actually, this is the question I've been agonizing most since you sent all these questions through, because I'm relatively good on the history of the tower, as you would expect, because it's my job. But I wouldn't classify myself as a Tudor historian. I work with many fantastic Tudor historians. I mean, Tracy Borman, Dr. Alden Gregory, Lucy does various Tudor bits and bobs. But no, I think my Tudor takeaway would be to read some of my fantastic colleagues' work on the HRP blogs website, which might be slightly boring, but not boring necessarily, but slightly basic. A suggestion, because I've listened to some of the other podcasts. And they all have different source lists and things like that. But yeah, I'm surrounded by people more intelligent and capable than myself, and I think that their work is all amazing. So read their work.
Read their work, not yours. Okay, we'll check out the.
There are
blog.
a few of my blogs on there, but they
Oh, good. Yeah, no, that's good. I'll put the link to the blog, and actually, when you get around to doing your article on the finds from the moat, let me know, and I can pop that on as well. Pop that link. That'd be really cool.
More than happy to.
Alfred, thank you so much for joining us on the show and talking Tudors with us.
Thank you for having me. It's been great fun.
Well, that brings us to the end of this episode of Talking Tudors. Thank you so much for joining us. I absolutely love to hear from listeners, so if you have any comments or suggestions, or just want to say hi, please get in touch with me via my website, www.onthetudortrail.com, where you'll also find show notes for today's episode. If you've enjoyed the show, please share the podcast with friends and family, and don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. I also invite you to join our Talking Tudors podcast group group on Facebook, where you can interact with other Tudor history lovers and hear all the behind-the-scenes news. You'll also find me on Twitter. My handle is On the Tudor Trail, and on Instagram as The Most Happy 78. It's time now for us to re-enter the modern world. As always, I look forward to talking Tudors with you again very soon.